The cruelest prisons are often the ones built inside a family's home. No one in Silver Hollow ever questioned why the Carter estate had one attic window that remained shuttered through every season. The servants were told never to climb the narrow staircase. Visitors were politely guided away from the eastern wing. Even children learned that asking about the locked room brought uncomfortable silence. Inside that forgotten corner of the grand house lived Evelyn Carter, a 20-year-old woman her own parents called broken. She had heard the word so many times that it no longer sounded like an insult. It had become the name they gave the life they believed she deserved. While her older sister Isabella practiced elegant greetings for noble guests and modeled expensive gowns before polished mirrors, Evelyn spent her mornings mending worn blankets for the servants, sewing tiny clothes for village children, and nursing injured birds that somehow always found their way to her small window. No one praised her kindness because almost no one admitted she existed. The housekeeper quietly accepted repaired linens without asking who had fixed them. Stable hands discovered healthy animals without knowing who had patiently cared for them through the night. Even the youngest servants smiled a little brighter after speaking with the mysterious young woman upstairs, though they never dared mention her name. Beyond the estate, excitement spread across the valley like wildfire. King Lucian Ashford, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, was visiting Silver Hollow for the first time in nearly a decade. Every noble family believed this was their chance to impress the ruler whose wisdom was spoken of almost as often as his unmatched authority. The Carter family polished every crystal chandelier, filled every hallway with fresh white roses, and rehearsed every smile they intended to wear before the king. Yet amid all the careful preparations, Lady Carter climbed the attic stairs with a single iron key in her hand. She unlocked the heavy door just long enough to leave a tray of food on the floor. "Stay here," she said without looking at her daughter. "No matter what you hear. Downstairs you are not to leave this room. If His Majesty sees you, everything we have worked for will be ruined." The lock clicked once more and silence returned. Evelyn carried the tray to the tiny window overlooking the front drive. Carriages rolled through the gates one after another as banners danced in the summer breeze. Somewhere beyond the hills, the Alpha King was already approaching. She had no way of knowing that before the sun set, the one person her family had hidden from the world would become the only person the king truly came to see. Morning sunlight slipped through the dusty attic window, painting thin ribbons of gold across the worn wooden floor. Evelyn rested her hand against the warm glass and watched the estate awaken below. Servants hurried across the courtyard carrying polished silver trays, fresh flowers, and folded table linens while gardeners carefully trimmed every hedge along the stone paths. The arrival of the Alpha King had transformed the Carter estate into a place that looked almost magical. Yet from where Evelyn stood, it felt farther away than ever. She turned from the window and glanced toward the wicker basket beside her bed. Inside, a small gray dove stretched its healing wing. Only 3 days earlier it had fallen during a violent summer storm, exhausted and unable to fly. Evelyn had patiently wrapped the injured wing with strips of soft linen, whispering gentle encouragement every morning until the frightened bird slowly trusted her touch. Now it fluttered onto her shoulder, its tiny heartbeat steady against her neck. A quiet smile crossed her face. Seeing something recover had always filled her with a peace she rarely found for herself. A soft knock interrupted the silence. The door opened only a few inches before Mrs. Harper, the elderly housekeeper, slipped inside carrying a basket of clean towels. She never stayed long enough for anyone to notice. Without a word she exchanged the worn towels for freshly washed ones, then quietly placed a folded piece of warm bread beside Evelyn's breakfast tray. "The children loved the blankets you repaired," she whispered with grateful eyes. Little Samuel slept through the entire night for the first time in weeks. Evelyn's smile grew brighter than any expensive jewel downstairs. "I am glad they are warm," she answered softly. Mrs. Harper hesitated before leaving. "You deserve to hear this. Not everyone believes what they say about you." The old woman disappeared before footsteps echoed in the hallway. Evelyn carefully hid the bread beneath a cloth, knowing another hungry servant would likely need it before evening. Throughout the morning she continued her quiet routine. She stitched torn sleeves, polished old wooden toys left behind by servants' children, and watered small herbs growing in cracked clay pots along the window. Every simple act reminded her that kindness could exist even when no one applauded it. Outside, Elegant carriages continued rolling through the front gates. Noble families stepped onto the stone drive wearing embroidered coats, sparkling gowns, and carefully practiced smiles. Their laughter drifted upward with the summer breeze. Evelyn could hear musicians tuning violins somewhere below, followed by the ringing of crystal glasses as preparations entered their final hours. Then something unusual caught her attention. From her high window she noticed a young stable boy struggling with a frightened white foal near the royal guest stables. The animal refused to move despite every gentle pull on its lead. Nervous servants began gathering, afraid the delay would embarrass the household before the king arrived. Evelyn watched quietly for a moment before opening the small wooden box beneath her bed. Inside rested several dried apple slices she had saved over the past week. She wrapped them carefully in a linen cloth, tied one end to a length of twine, and slowly lowered the bundle from her attic window until it reached the confused stable boy below. He looked upward in surprise. Evelyn simply smiled and pointed toward the trembling foal. Understanding immediately, the boy offered the sweet fruit with an open hand. Within seconds the frightened animal relaxed, stepped forward willingly, and followed him toward the stable. No one noticed the hidden young woman above. No one except a tall rider entering through the distant gates whose sharp silver eyes briefly lifted toward the highest window before the great front doors welcomed him inside. King Lucian Ashford stepped through the towering entrance of the Carter estate, with the calm confidence of a man who had spent his life carrying responsibility, rather than seeking admiration. Nobles bowed as he passed. Servants lowered their eyes. Lady Carter greeted him with a flawless smile, while Lord Carter proudly introduced Isabella, whose graceful manners and carefully rehearsed charm earned polite compliments from every guest nearby. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm candlelight across the grand ballroom. Musicians filled the air with elegant melodies, and conversations flowed as smoothly as the sparkling cider served in polished glasses. Everything appeared perfect, yet something about the estate felt strangely incomplete. Lucian had visited countless noble homes throughout the Northern Territories, and experience had taught him that the true character of a household was rarely found in expensive decorations or practiced smiles. It lived in the smallest details. As he accepted greetings from local leaders, his attention drifted toward the servants. Their uniforms, though simple, had been carefully repaired with remarkable precision. A young maid quietly comforted an anxious child using a beautifully stitched cloth doll that clearly had been mended many times. Near the fireplace, an elderly butler carried himself with surprising confidence despite his age, wearing boots that had obviously been restored instead of replaced. Even the frightened white foal outside now stood peacefully beside the stable, calmly accepting gentle pats from the same young boy who had struggled with it only minutes before. None of these things matched the proud image the Carter family tried so carefully to display. They reflected patience instead of wealth, kindness instead of status. Lucian noticed them all. During dinner, Lady Carter enthusiastically described her family's achievements, while Lord Carter spoke of profitable harvests, respected alliances, and Isabella's accomplishments. Isabella answered every question with polished elegance, yet her responses sounded rehearsed rather than sincere. Lucian remained courteous, but his attention repeatedly wandered elsewhere. Every few moments he sensed an unfamiliar calm settling over the estate, almost like the quiet feeling that lingered after the first snowfall of winter. It was subtle, impossible to explain, yet impossible to ignore. He glanced toward the eastern hallway more than once, each time catching servants exchanging nervous looks before quickly lowering their heads. One hallway remained noticeably empty despite the crowded celebration. No guest entered it. No servant lingered there longer than necessary. It was as though the entire household silently agreed that part of the estate simply did not exist. Finally, while musicians performed another graceful piece and the guests became distracted by conversation, Lucian excused himself from the ballroom. His captain of the guard followed several steps behind, but the king quietly motioned for him to remain where he was. Alone, Lucian walked through the peaceful corridor lined with family portraits. Every painting celebrated generations of proud Carters, yet one detail immediately caught his attention. Between portraits of smiling relatives hung an empty space where another painting had clearly once been displayed. The outline remained visible against the wall, untouched by sunlight. Someone had deliberately removed a member of the family from its history. A faint breeze drifted through an open window, carrying with it the delicate scent of lavender and fresh herbs. Lucian paused. It was the same quiet scent he had noticed since arriving, gentle enough to disappear if he tried to chase it, yet always returning when he stood still. He slowly lifted his eyes toward the staircase leading upward. Somewhere beyond those silent steps, hidden behind closed doors and forgotten hallways, someone was waiting without even knowing that the first person who truly questioned her absence had finally arrived. Lucian climbed the narrow staircase without making a sound, following the faint fragrance of lavender that seemed to drift just beyond his reach. Unlike the polished marble halls below, the upper corridor carried the quiet stillness of a place long forgotten. Dust rested along the windowsills, yet the floorboards had recently been swept. Someone still lived here. Someone cared enough to keep even an abandoned corner of the estate clean. At the end of the hallway stood a weathered oak door with a heavy iron lock hanging open, as though whoever had secured it in such a hurry had forgotten to close it again after delivering the evening meal. Before Lucian could reach it, a cool summer breeze swept through an open window, gently pushing the old door inward. It opened only a few inches, but it was enough. Through the narrow opening, he saw a young woman kneeling beside the small gray dove resting on her shoulder. She smiled as she carefully untied the linen wrapped around its wing, her movements so patient and gentle that the frightened bird did not attempt to fly away. Nearby, several tiny clay pots overflowed with herbs, and neatly folded blankets rested beside baskets filled with repaired toys and carefully stitched clothing. The room was humble, yet every corner reflected quiet kindness rather than sorrow. Hearing the hinges creak, Evelyn slowly turned toward the doorway. For a single suspended moment, neither of them spoke. She had expected another servant bringing instructions, another reminder to remain invisible. Instead, she found herself looking into calm silver eyes unlike any she had ever seen. There was no disgust in them, no pity, only quiet curiosity. Before either of them could speak, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. Lady Carter appeared first, followed closely by Lord Carter and Isabella. The color drained from their faces the instant they realized who stood outside the attic room. "Your Majesty," Lady Carter exclaimed, forcing an uneasy smile as she rushed forward. "Please forgive this unfortunate misunderstanding." She quickly moved between Lucian and the doorway, trying to block his view. "This room is not meant for guests." Lucian remained perfectly still. "Who is she?" he asked in a calm voice. The question seemed to strike the family harder than any accusation could have. Lord Carter lowered his eyes before answering. "She is our younger daughter, Evelyn." He hesitated just long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. "She has always been different." Lady Carter immediately continued, eager to explain. "She was born without the qualities expected of our family. She is gentle where strength is required, quiet where confidence is needed. We believed it best to protect both her and our household from unnecessary attention." Isabella remained silent, avoiding her sister's eyes. Lucian looked past them toward Evelyn, who still stood inside the small room with one hand resting lightly against the windowsill. She did not interrupt. She did not defend herself. Years of being spoken about instead of spoken to had taught her that silence was often safer than hope. Yet the more Lucian observed her, the less the family's explanation made sense. Nothing about the young woman before him suggested someone deserving to be hidden away. If anything, the room itself quietly revealed a truth the grand ballroom downstairs had failed to show. Every repaired blanket, every thriving herb, every healed bird spoke of a heart that patiently restored whatever the world had overlooked. And for the first time since arriving at the Carter estate, Lucian realized that the greatest secret hidden within its walls was not ashamed to be concealed, but a remarkable soul no one had cared enough to truly see. The silence in the attic lingered long after Lord Carter finished speaking. King Lucian did not immediately respond. Instead, he stepped into the modest room with the same quiet respect he would have shown inside a royal library or a sacred hall. His eyes moved slowly across every carefully arranged corner. The shelves were built from reclaimed wood. The curtains had been patched so skillfully that the repairs were almost invisible. Small clay bowls collected rainwater for the herbs growing beside the window. Nothing reflected luxury, yet everything reflected care. Evelyn lowered her gaze, uncertain whether she should remain or leave. Before she could decide, the gray dove gently fluttered from her shoulder and landed on the windowsill. Lucian watched as the bird remained perfectly calm beside her. Wild creatures rarely trusted strangers so completely. "Did you heal its wing?" he asked softly. Evelyn hesitated before answering. "It mostly healed itself. I only gave it time and a quiet place to rest." Her voice carried no pride, only simple honesty. Lucian nodded almost to himself. That is often more valuable than people realize. Lady Carter forced a nervous laugh. "Your Majesty is very kind, but Evelyn has always preferred little hobbies instead of learning the responsibilities expected of a noble daughter." Lucian looked toward the folded blankets stacked neatly beside the bed. "The blankets in your servants' quarters were repaired by these same hobbies, were they not?" Lady Carter's smile faltered. No one answered. He continued walking until he reached the basket of toys. One wooden horse had been carefully carved and polished despite years of use. Another doll wore tiny hand-stitched clothes made from scraps of fabric that matched pieces he had noticed in the laundry room earlier that evening. Suddenly the countless details that had caught his attention throughout the estate fit together like pieces of the same picture. The repaired uniforms, the calm stable animals, the warm blankets, the smiling children, the peaceful atmosphere hidden beneath the family's polished image. They had all begun here, inside the room no guest was ever meant to see. Lucian turned back toward Evelyn. "Did anyone thank you?" he asked. She looked surprised by the question itself. After a long pause, she answered with a gentle smile. "They do not have to. If someone sleeps a little warmer or worries a little less, that is enough for me." The words settled over the room more heavily than any formal speech delivered during the banquet downstairs. Even Isabella quietly looked away, unable to meet her younger sister's eyes. For the first time that evening, Lucian noticed something deeper than kindness. He saw quiet strength. Not the kind measured by titles, wealth, or applause, but the rare strength that remained gentle after years of being overlooked. He had met celebrated warriors who carried less dignity than the young woman standing before him. As evening shadows stretched across the attic floor, distant music drifted upward from the ballroom below, reminding everyone that the royal banquet was still continuing. Yet for Lucian, the celebration downstairs no longer seemed important. The most remarkable person in the Carter estate had never entered the grand hall, never sought attention, and never expected to be noticed. Hidden behind a locked door, she had quietly transformed the lives of everyone around her without asking for recognition. In that quiet realization, the king understood that the greatest measure of character was not found in the people who stood closest to the throne, but in the person who continued choosing kindness even when the world refused to see her. As the quiet conversation settled into thoughtful silence, another voice unexpectedly rose from the hallway. "Your Majesty, if I may." Everyone turned toward Mrs. Harper, who stood near the open doorway with folded hands and lowered eyes. She clearly understood she had interrupted a conversation far above her station, yet something stronger than fear had brought her forward. Lucian gave a slight nod. "Speak freely." The elderly housekeeper drew a slow breath before looking toward Evelyn with unmistakable affection. "I have served this family for 32 years, she began. "I watched Miss Evelyn take her first steps across these very floors. She has never been what they call broken." Lord Carter stiffened. "Mrs. Harper, that will be enough." Lucian calmly raised one hand without taking his eyes from the housekeeper. "Please continue." Encouraged, she spoke with quiet conviction. When the young servants became frightened during winter storms, she sat with them until they stopped trembling. When children became ill, she stayed awake through the night cooling their foreheads with fresh cloths. When old Mr. Collins lost his wife, she repaired every family quilt he owned because she knew he could not bear to throw away anything that reminded him of her. She has always noticed pain before anyone else did. Evelyn lowered her head, embarrassed by the attention. Mrs. Harper smiled gently. "When she was only 12 years old, she began telling me she could almost feel what others carried inside them, not hear their thoughts, not perform magic. She simply sensed sadness, loneliness, fear, and hope before anyone spoke a single word. She always knew who needed kindness most." Lucian listened without interrupting. The explanation did not sound like weakness. It sounded like an extraordinary gift that had been misunderstood. Lady Carter quickly stepped forward. That sensitivity is exactly the problem, Your Majesty. Our world respects confidence, leadership, and strength. She cried whenever others suffered. She worried about everyone except herself. We feared people would believe something was wrong with our family. Lucian slowly turned toward her. So you hid compassion because it did not resemble power? Lady Carter opened her mouth but found no answer. The question lingered heavily in the room. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. They believed they were protecting me. Lucian looked at her with quiet understanding. And who protected you? The words caught her completely by surprise. For a long moment she could not answer because no one had ever asked that question before. She searched her memories and realized every comforting word she had received had come from servants, children, or strangers passing through the village, never from those who should have offered it first. Outside, church bells echoed across Silver Hollow, announcing the beginning of the evening ceremony waiting below. Guests filled the ballroom expecting speeches, music, and formal introductions, unaware that something far more important had already begun in the forgotten attic. Lucian glanced once more around the small room before meeting Evelyn's eyes. The hesitation she carried was not born from weakness. It had been carefully placed there by years of being told she should remain unseen. Yet beneath that quiet uncertainty he recognized remarkable courage, the kind that continued choosing generosity despite receiving almost none in return. In that moment the Alpha King made a silent decision. Before the night ended, the entire Carter estate would learn that true strength had never been locked away in the grand ballroom below. It had been waiting patiently behind a forgotten attic door all along. The grand ballroom fell silent the moment King Lucian returned. Conversations faded into whispers as every noble guest rose from polished chairs, expecting another ceremonial toast or announcement about alliances. Instead, the Alpha King walked with calm purpose toward the center of the room before turning to face the grand staircase. "Bring Miss Evelyn Carter," he said clearly. The request swept through the hall like an unexpected wind. Lady Carter's smile disappeared. Lord Carter stood frozen. Isabella lowered her eyes, unable to hide her growing unease. Several nobles exchanged puzzled glances, quietly asking one another who Evelyn Carter was. The servants, however, knew the answer immediately. Mrs. Harper gently climbed the staircase and returned a few moments later with Evelyn walking beside her. She wore the same simple blue dress she had spent years carefully repairing whenever the fabric became worn. It carried no jewels, no embroidered symbols, no expensive lace. Yet as she descended each step, the ballroom seemed to grow quieter still. Evelyn hesitated when she reached the final stair. Hundreds of unfamiliar eyes rested upon her. For a heartbeat, the years of hiding returned all at once, urging her to step back into the shadows she knew so well. Then Lucian offered a reassuring nod, not as a king commanding obedience, but as someone inviting another person to stand without fear. She slowly crossed the marble floor until she stood before him. No one spoke. Lucian turned toward the assembled guests. "Tonight I have been welcomed into this estate with fine decorations, generous meals, and polished speeches," he began. "I have seen beautiful clothing, valuable treasures, and carefully prepared ceremonies." He paused, allowing every word to settle. "But the greatest treasure within this house was never presented to me." Murmurs spread across the room. Lady Carter stepped forward with visible anxiety. "Your Majesty, surely there has been some misunderstanding." Lucian met her gaze with quiet composure. "There has indeed been a misunderstanding. Not mine. Yours." His voice never rose, yet every corner of the ballroom heard him clearly. "You believed strength could only be measured by status, confidence, and admiration. Yet I have spent this evening discovering that your servants wear repaired uniforms because of her hands. Your children sleep warmly because of her work. Injured animals trust her without fear. Lonely hearts have found comfort because she noticed their pain before anyone else did." No one interrupted. Even the musicians stood perfectly still. Lucian looked toward Evelyn. "You were told that kindness made you less worthy. I believe it has made you extraordinary." Evelyn felt tears gather in her eyes, but she remained composed. She had imagined countless times what it might feel like to simply be acknowledged, yet reality surpassed every quiet dream she had carried alone in the attic. The Alpha King removed the deep blue royal cloak resting across his shoulders. Without ceremony or spectacle, he gently placed it around Evelyn's shoulders. The embroidered crest of the Northern Territory settled across the simple dress she had believed no one would ever notice. A quiet gasp moved through the ballroom. Lucian faced the gathering once more. From this evening forward, no one in this kingdom will speak of Evelyn Carter as someone to be hidden. She will be welcomed wherever I am welcomed, treated with the respect every person deserves, and remembered not for the names others placed upon her, but for the goodness she chose every single day. In that unforgettable moment, the applause did not begin with nobles seeking favor. It began with the servants standing quietly along the walls, followed by the stable hands, the cooks, the housekeepers, and finally every guest who realized they had just witnessed something far greater than royal tradition. They had witnessed justice wrapped in kindness, and it changed the entire room. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling inside the ballroom did not. It lingered in every corner like the warmth of sunrise after a long winter night. Evelyn stood quietly beneath the weight of the royal cloak, uncertain whether she should smile or simply breathe. For years she had imagined what it might feel like to be seen. She had never imagined it would happen before an entire kingdom. King Lucian remained beside her, not to draw attention to himself, but to make certain no one would ever ask her to step back into the shadows again. Guests who had overlooked the servants throughout the evening now found themselves looking at them differently. They noticed grateful smiles, respectful glances, and quiet tears that had nothing to do with fear. The people who had known Evelyn in silence had always understood her worth. It was the rest of the room that had finally begun to catch up. An elderly village physician slowly approached the center of the hall and bowed before the king. "Your Majesty," he said, "may I share something?" Lucian nodded. The physician turned toward the gathered guests. 5 winters ago, an illness spread through Silver Hollow. I visited nearly every household. During those difficult weeks, I often found medicine already waiting beside the sick before I arrived. Fresh soup appeared on empty tables. Firewood was stacked outside lonely homes before sunrise. Blankets somehow reached families who had lost everything in the snow. I searched for years to learn who had quietly helped so many people. He smiled gently at Evelyn. "Tonight I finally have my answer." Soft murmurs spread across the ballroom once again, but this time they carried admiration instead of confusion. Another voice spoke. It belonged to the young stable boy who had calmed the frightened white foal earlier that day. With nervous courage he stepped forward and held up the small linen cloth that had carried the dried apple slices from the attic window. "She helped me this afternoon," he admitted. Nobody else knew what to do. She did. A cook smiled through grateful tears. A gardener quietly nodded. One by one, people who had benefited from Evelyn's unseen kindness found the courage to speak. None of them described miracles. They described simple acts of compassion that had quietly changed ordinary days. Lucian listened to every story without interrupting. When the final voice grew silent, he looked across the room and said, "A kingdom is not strengthened only by those who lead from great halls. It is strengthened every day by people who choose kindness when no one is watching." No one disagreed. Even Lord Carter lowered his head, unable to escape the truth surrounding him. He realized that everything he had tried to hide had become the very reason others now respected his daughter. Evelyn looked around the ballroom, recognizing faces she had only glimpsed from distant windows or quiet hallways. For the first time, those faces were smiling back at her without hesitation. The fear that had lived inside her for so many years did not disappear all at once, but something stronger quietly took its place. Hope. It was gentle, almost fragile, yet it continued growing with every sincere smile and every grateful glance. As the evening drew closer to its end, the grand hall no longer felt like a place reserved for titles or appearances. It had become something far more meaningful. It had become the place where a forgotten young woman discovered that the goodness she had quietly given away for years had been remembered by far more hearts than she had ever dared to believe. When the final guests began leaving the Carter estate, the night air felt different, lighter somehow, as though the house itself had finally released a secret it had carried for far too long. Lanterns glowed along the stone pathway, while carriages disappeared into the quiet streets of Silver Hollow. Evelyn stood beneath the wide front entrance wearing the royal cloak that still rested gently across her shoulders. For years she had watched this same view from a tiny attic window, believing the world beyond the gates was a place where she would never belong. Now she stood at the very center of it. King Lucian approached with the same calm expression that had never once made her feel small. "There is one more question I wish to ask you," he said. Evelyn looked at him with quiet curiosity. "Will you visit the royal sanctuary?" She blinked in surprise. "The sanctuary?" Lucian smiled. "It is where injured animals recover, where children who have lost their families find safety, and where those forgotten by society begin again. I believe they have been waiting for someone like you, even if they do not know it yet." Evelyn looked toward the distant hills beyond the estate. For the first time in many years, the future no longer appeared frightening. It simply looked unknown, and somehow that felt beautiful. She nodded gently. "I would be honored." Mrs. Harper quietly wiped away a tear while several servants smiled with open pride. Even the stable boy waved excitedly as the white foal peacefully followed behind him across the courtyard. Lord and Lady Carter stood together in thoughtful silence. They finally understood that respect could never be built by hiding what made someone different. It was earned by recognizing goodness wherever it appeared. Isabella slowly stepped toward her younger sister. "I should have stood beside you long ago," she whispered. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment before offering a gentle smile. "Then stand beside me now." It was a simple answer, but it carried more grace than years of resentment ever could. As dawn's first light touched the rooftops of Silver Hollow, the small attic window where Evelyn had spent so many lonely mornings caught the rising sun. The room was still there, unchanged, yet it no longer defined her life. Some doors were meant to protect people. Others only kept them from becoming who they were always meant to be. Evelyn walked through the front gates beside King Lucian, not because a crown had changed her worth, but because someone had finally recognized the kindness she had quietly carried all along. And from that morning forward, whenever people spoke of the Carter family, they no longer remembered the daughter who had been hidden away. They remembered the woman whose gentle heart reminded an entire kingdom that true strength is never measured by how loudly the world sees you, but by how faithfully you choose compassion when no one is looking.